Cleveland, Ohio. October 2008. A thick fog blanketed the rooftops of Slavic Village, muting the colors of this old Catholic neighborhood. In the still morning air, the bells of St. Stanislaus Church tolled softly, their sound scattering into the chill. On the worn stone steps, parishioners, bundled in heavy coats, filed quietly into the sanctuary. But it was the basement that drew every eye that day. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance. Workers and police moved in and out, carrying sealed evidence boxes one by one. In a far corner, Father Michael Harris stood against the wall, fingers clutching a weathered prayer book, his eyes fixed on the cold tile floor where dust still clung. Last night, they broke open a brick wall in the basement, and behind it lay what this community had feared and whispered about for 28 long years. Cleveland, Ohio. October 1980. A thick fog clung to the brick streets of Slavic Village that morning, the yellow glow of street lamps swallowed by the chill coming off the lake. Atop St. Stanislaus Church, the blackened crosses loomed silently against a leaden sky. Inside, the sanctuary smelled faintly of wax and incense. Elderly parishioners, children, and shift workers knelt quietly in the pews, murmuring prayers. But on the left side of the nave, the 4 seats usually reserved for the church's nuns remained empty. Mary Johnson, Catherine White, Anna Lewis, and Elizabeth Miller. Everyone knew them. Gentle, devoted women who'd spent years teaching children to read, tending to the sick, and feeding the homeless. Every morning, without fail, they appeared through the side door in crisp white habits, clutching their Bibles, nodding to parishioners with quiet smiles. But today, no one had seen them. When morning mass ended, the parish priest, Father Patrick O'Connor, and 2 congregants went to knock on the nuns' quarters. The door was ajar, but locked from the inside. They called out several times. No answer. Finally, O'Connor forced the lock. Inside, the room was neat to the point of being eerie. Beds made tight, habits hanging in perfect order. On the table, 4 untouched breakfasts. An open Bible lay across one desk, its page slightly creased as though fingers had only just let go. Outside, the church bells rang again, their metallic song floating through the fog. Neighbors gathered at the gates, whispering nervously, some running door to door. No one in the close-knit community could believe the 4 women had simply chosen to leave. Certainly not without a word, leaving everything behind. That afternoon, Cleveland police arrived. A row of cruisers lined the narrow street, red and blue lights washing over the church's brick facade. Officers searched the basement, the roof, the gardens out back. They checked for footprints, questioned the neighbors. But it was as if the 4 women had vanished into the fog itself. That night, as darkness fell, the bells tolled once more. O'Connor stood before the altar, staring out at the empty pews, his face pale, stunned. He didn't know it yet, but those bells would come to haunt Slavic Village, marking the beginning of a mystery no one dared name for nearly 3 decades to come. By the next morning, news of the disappearance had swept through Slavic Village. Utility poles along Fleet Avenue were plastered with missing posters. 4 faint photographs of Mary Johnson, Catherine White, Anna Lewis, and Elizabeth Miller printed on white paper with the words, "Missing. If seen, or if you have any information, contact Cleveland Police." Neighbors crowded the church steps in small knots, whispering, speculating. Nobody could believe the 4 nuns, women of such quiet devotion and kindness, would simply leave on their own. Some of the elderly shook their heads, fingering their rosaries and muttering about a test from God. Others, more nervous, spoke of seeing a dark figure standing at the church gates that night, vanishing into the fog. Police expanded the search across the city. Mounted officers, K-9 units, even helicopters combed the fields outside town. They swept alleys, abandoned basements, questioning anyone who might know something, but every lead ended in nothing. The name Joseph Walker surfaced early. He had worked as a janitor at the church, often lingering in the wine cellar before abruptly quitting a few weeks prior. But nobody could place him at the church the night the women disappeared, and so he slipped out of suspicion. Day by day, the small blurbs about the case slid deeper into the inside pages of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. What began as 4 nuns vanished mysteriously became, within weeks, no new leads. Among parishioners, people began calling it the Slavicvillage nightmare, a quiet nightmare everyone knew about. But no one dared speak aloud. Father O'Connor grew gaunt and withdrawn. He stopped preaching, seldom leaving his quarters, his face hollow and aged in just a few short months. He spent long hours in prayer behind closed doors, candlelight casting his shadow across the cold stone floor. Through that winter, Slavicvillage sank into a strange silence. At night, the wind slipped through narrow streets, and the bells tolled into the darkness, each note like an echoing reminder that the 4 gentle women had never returned. Over time, the grief settled into something heavier, a shameful secret the parish quietly buried under the dust of years. No one imagined that 28 years later, that secret would rise again from the very walls that had hidden it for so long. In 2001, more than 20 years after that grim autumn morning, St. Stanislaus welcomed a new priest. Father Michael Harris arrived in Cleveland from a small parish in Toledo. He was younger than the congregation expected, his eyes stern, his hair neatly graying, but his voice still warm and steady. In his first homily, he never mentioned the missing nuns. No one asked. Him too. But he could feel it. He felt it in the way their faded photographs stared back at him from the parish hall walls. He felt it in the hush that fell each time their names were spoken during memorial prayers, each syllable heavy in the air. And each night, as he passed the narrow hallway leading down into the basement, a chill crept up his spine. That basement was a maze of shadows, thick with dust and the kind of dampness that never quite went away. A few weak yellow bulbs flickered over the columns, their light swallowed by cobwebs. Some nights, when the wind slipped through the cracks in the brickwork, he swore he heard something, faint whispers, like half-finished prayers, still echoing somewhere in the dark. Father Harris was not a superstitious man, but he knew this church carried a wound that had never fully healed. The old parishioners still said to him quietly, "That night, they walked out, and never came back. We've buried that night in our rosaries, hoping to forget. But it's never left us, Father." More than once, Harris found himself thinking, why hasn't anyone torn that wall down? Why hasn't anyone pried it apart to see what's behind? But he never spoke those thoughts aloud. After all, the police had scoured every inch of the church for weeks back then. They said nothing was there, or maybe they'd been wrong. Then, one summer afternoon in 2008, during a parish meeting, a congregant proposed renovating the basement into a library and meeting room. Harris simply nodded. "Fine," he said. That night, standing alone in the basement, he ran his fingers over the rough, cold bricks at the end of the hallway. The wall seemed to breathe faintly into the damp air. He stared at it for a long time before turning back up the stairs. He didn't yet know that decision would tear open the scar Slavicvillage had spent nearly 3 decades trying to bury. Summer 2008. For the first time in years, the basement of St. Stanislaus buzzed with life. Loads of new bricks, wooden beams, and cans of paint were hauled in. Workers in coveralls descended the stairs carrying lights and hammers. The sound of pounding, drilling, and chiseling echoed through the cold stone walls. Father Harris stood on the stairwell, watching them. He said nothing, only nodding faintly when the foreman glanced up to assure him the work was on schedule. But deep in his eyes, something restless lingered. One afternoon, as the sunlight retreated from the narrow basement window above, a young worker called up, "Father Harris, you better come see this." He descended slowly. The deeper he went, the colder the air felt. Under the harsh glare of halogen lights, the crew was gathered around the far end of the hallway, where a section of bricks had been pried loose, revealing a black void beyond. The foreman wiped his brow and pointed. "We thought it was just a solid wall, but there's some kind of space behind it, hollow, and it smells odd." Father Harris stepped closer. A damp, metallic sweetness wafted out of the gap. He bent slightly, peering into the darkness, and felt a chill run down his back. "Keep going," he ordered, his voice low but steady. The hammers rang out again. Brick by brick, the wall crumbled, dust billowing into the air. When the opening was finally wide enough, a beam of flashlight pierced into the recess. A cramped, eerie void, silent. And there, in the stillness, something pale began to emerge. The workers froze. One stepped back, murmuring, "Oh God." Inside the hollow, stacked neatly, lay 4 forms draped in dust and the remnants of worn habits, the faint silver crosses on their chests dulled by time. White bones glinted under the flashlight, quiet and waiting, as though they had been expecting to be found all these years. Father Harris stood motionless, his fingers clutching the cross at his neck, his face taut as stone. He knew. He had always known. Somewhere behind these walls, the truth waited, if only someone dared to knock. Above, the church bells began to toll, their notes spilling down into the basement like a judgment. That day, Slavicvillage's wound split open at last. When the bells above finally fell silent, the basement sank into a heavy hush, broken only by the workers' quickened breaths. Flashlights swept over the hollow, their beams trembling on the 4 dust-covered forms. The remnants of tattered habits, stirring faintly in a cold draft, seeping through the crack. Father Harris stood at the edge of the opening, his sunken eyes fixed on the white bones glinting faintly inside. Slowly, he bent down and ran his fingers over the broken brick, feeling the gritty dust cling to his skin. "Stop," he said quietly, his voice low but firm. The workers froze, confused, glancing at one another uneasily. One man clasped his hands and muttered under his breath, "Dear God." Father Harris straightened, took the foreman's radio in a shaky hand, and pressed the button. "Dispatch, this is St. Stanislaus Church. We need a team here immediately. Possible human remains. 4. His voice caught in his throat. He gripped the cross on his collarbone tight, his eyes never leaving the hollow. Less than 30 minutes later, the sound of sirens wailed through the narrow streets of Slavicvillage. Red and blue lights strobed against the stained glass of the church above. The forensics team descended quickly, clad in white protective suits, gloves, and masks. They stretched yellow tape across the area, wheeled in large halogen lamps that washed the recess in a cold, sterile glow. A female technician knelt down, extending a probe to each skeleton. The air smelled of dust, damp stone, and something faintly metallic. In her notebook she scribbled, "Confirmed, 4 human remains, habits present, preserved due to dry, sealed environment." Under closer light, the skeletons kept their shape, joints still aligned. The one skeletal hand of the first still clutched a broken rosary, 3 beads shattered. Another technician gently peeled back the moldy fabric on the chest of the second, revealing a tarnished silver cross, its engraving faint. Mary J. Father Harris took a step back, his knuckles white as he clenched the cross at his neck. He had known, but not how brutal and undeniable it would be. A uniformed officer murmured, "Call the coroner's office. Hold the scene overnight." Above, townsfolk pressed against the doors, craning to see down the stairwell where yellow tape glimmered in the dark. Someone whispered, "Is it really them?" No one answered. That night, as the bodies were lifted, one by one, into numbered white bags and carried to the waiting coroner's van, the church bells tolled again. But this time, their sound hung over Slavicvillage, like both a farewell and a judgment. Father Harris stood at the basement door, watching each bag disappear. In his eyes was sorrow, but also something deeper. As though he had broken a curse no one else had dared to touch for 30 years. Slavicvillage was shaken when the news was confirmed. The 4 remains found in the church basement belonged to Mary Johnson, Catherine White, Anna Lewis, and Elizabeth Miller, the 4 nuns who had vanished in 1980. Local media swarmed the church, cameras and reporters crowding the courtyard, shouting over one another at the basement door. Headlines screamed across the morning papers, "Secret of St. Stanislaus unearthed. 4 nuns murdered. Community demands justice." Cleveland police, working with the county prosecutor's office, reopened the cold case. Yellowed files were pulled from storage, brittle statements reread, every former suspect reviewed. And quickly, one name rose to the top: Joseph Walker. He'd been the church janitor, a quiet, sullen man who lingered in the wine cellar, sometimes sneaking a drink and smirking when caught. People recalled he quit abruptly just weeks after the nuns vanished, citing exhaustion, and left Cleveland. Back then, police had questioned him, but with no hard evidence, he was let go. This time, they wouldn't make the same mistake. Samples collected from the wall were rushed for DNA comparison. Within 72 hours, the results came back. A match to Joseph Walker, now living under his real name in Sarasota, Florida. The next morning, a team of investigators flew south. They found his place, a run-down roadside motel, its walls streaked with moss, the windows gray with dust. When they knocked, a thin, hollow-eyed man with white hair answered, his cracked lips trembling faintly. "Joseph Walker?" He didn't reply. He simply dropped his gaze and stepped back. On his table lay an old Bible, left open, and beside it, a broken rosary. The room smelled of mildew and stale liquor. Walker was handcuffed and led to the car without a word. He didn't resist, didn't ask why, didn't look at anyone. He only pressed his lips together, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. That night, Ohio's evening news blared across television statewide. Suspect in St. Stanislaus, nun murders arrested in Florida after 28 years on the run. In Cleveland, Father Harris stood at his office window, watching the courtyard below aglow with candlelight as parishioners gathered to pray. His hand gripped the wooden frame, his eyes closing, feeling both a fragile sense of relief and a deep, unshakable sorrow. The interrogation room at Cleveland Police Headquarters stayed lit through the night. On the table sat a cooling cup of coffee and a thick case file stamped Joseph Walker. He slumped in his chair, bony hands cuffed in front of him, his eyes hollow. His gaunt, aged face betrayed little, but in his gaze there was still something sharp, defiant, as if the years hadn't dulled it. The lead detective sat across from him, sliding a photograph into the center of the table, 4 faces staring back, their names printed below: Mary Johnson, Catherine White, Anna Lewis, Elizabeth Miller. Walker glanced down, his expression unflinching. "We found them," the detective said, his voice low, each word striking like a hammer. "In the basement wall. You know that." Walker leaned back, closing his eyes, briefly. Then he chuckled. A rough, dry sound caught in his throat. They never left there," he murmured. "Why?" the detective pressed, his tone sharpening. Walker opened his eyes, meeting the detective's stare, a faint smile curling on his lips. "They always thought they were better, purer, but they were weak, just like the rest of us. That night, I just wanted them to stop. I couldn't take it anymore. They screamed, they begged, but I still did it." He spoke as though recounting a dream, each word slow, detached, empty of remorse. "They died that night. One wall hid everything." Behind the one-way glass, Father Harris stood silently, watching. His fingers gripped the cross at his neck, until his knuckles turned white. He didn't cry. He only bowed his head and whispered a prayer. Joseph Walker had finally said everything. Not to repent, but to unburden himself. He quietly signed the confession, a faint smirk still clinging to his face as they led him out, the harsh neon light catching his gray skin and those hollow eyes, as if his soul had been left behind in that cold basement 30 years ago. And in Slavic Village, the church bells tolled late into the night, echoing through the dark sky like a mournful lament. The trial opened in early spring of 2009. The Cuyahoga County courtroom was packed to the walls. Every seat in the gallery was filled with parishioners from St. Stanislaus, reporters jostling for space, camera lenses glinting from the back rows. Joseph Walker shuffled in, clad in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed, his gaze brazen, never dropping. He sat, his face gaunt, but his eyes still. carrying that same cold glint, as if none of this touched him. In the front row, Father Harris sat silently among the elderly parishioners, his hands clenched around a rosary. When the prosecutor displayed the crime scene photographs, 4 white body bags lined up, fractured skulls, a broken silver cross. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the rustle of paper and the occasional stifled sob. Testimony, forensics, Walker's own confession. The case was built like a net closing around him. When given the chance to speak, Walker only smirked faintly. He looked up at the gallery, his eyes meeting Father Harris's, and said coldly, "I don't regret it. 30 years ago, I did what I wanted. Don't expect me to apologize." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. People shook their heads, tears falling. Father Harris closed his eyes, whispering a quiet prayer. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours before returning its verdict. Guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. The judge's voice rang sharp, his words cutting through the silence. "Joseph Walker, you are hereby sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole." The gavel slammed down, its echo resounding through the room. Walker gave a faint, bitter smile as he stood, escorted away, his hollow figure fading through the door without so much as a glance back. That afternoon, the bells of St. Stanislaus tolled across the neighborhood, each heavy note rolling over the rooftops of Slavic Village like a divine sentence of its own. Father Harris stepped slowly out of the courthouse, pausing at the top of the steps to look toward the church tower. His shoulders eased a little, but his eyes stayed wet, because he knew, even with justice delivered, this wound would remain in the community like a scar that would never truly heal. Weeks after the trial ended, Slavic Village slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The reporters were gone, the flashes had faded. But in the hearts of the parishioners, nothing felt quite the same. In the courtyard of St. Stanislaus, 4 small stone markers now stood side by side, engraved with the names Mary Johnson, Catherine White, Anna Lewis, Elizabeth Miller. Every evening people stopped by, lighting candles beneath the stones, bowing their heads in quiet prayer. Father Harris continued to lead Mass as always, but after each service, he lingered alone, walking the narrow corridor down to the basement, stopping before the wall that was no longer there. He stood there for long moments, staring into the dark hollow, lips moving in silent prayers only he could hear. One autumn evening, as the wind swept cold through the narrow streets of Slavic Village, the church bells rang out again. Their sound drifted far, slow and heavy, like one final farewell. Inside the sanctuary, Father Harris knelt before the altar, eyes closed. He knew justice had been done, but he also knew the pain of this community, and the memory of those 4 women would never truly disappear. Outside, the candles flickered in the wind. Their small flames burned on, fragile yet unwavering, much like the faith of the people here, quietly enduring, quietly hoping. And high above, the bells of St. Stanislaus continued to ring, reminding all of Slavic Village that no matter how deeply the truth is buried, it will always find its way to the light.